Be Me 21 psychology student. Have two best friends, Cameron and Addison. We've been a tight-knit group since freshman year. Inseparable. You know the type. Our thing, our big unifying ideology, was modern feminism. We read the books. We went to the campus talks. We had the talking points down cold. Our worldview was basically that society is a rigged game and men hold all the cheat codes. Every interaction with a guy was filtered through this lens. A man holding a door open, condescending patriarchal gesture, a guy trying to make small talk in line for coffee. He's trying to invade our space, a classmate disagreeing with a female professor. Obvious, textbook mansplaining. This was our reality. We saw it everywhere all the time. Cameron was the most intense about it. She was the leader, the true believer. She saw malice and toxicity in everything a man did, every glance, every word. Addison was more of a follower. She agreed with everything Cameron said, mostly because it was easier than disagreeing. I was somewhere in the middle. I believed in the core ideas, but being a psych major, I couldn't help but look for patterns in behavior. And I was starting to see a pattern that didn't quite fit our narrative. The story really kicks off a few months ago, maybe late last semester. We were in our usual spot at the campus coffee shop after a particularly long lecture. Cameron was on a tirade, absolutely fuming. Apparently, some guy in class had the audacity to question a statistic the professor presented. She was going on about how he was trying to undermine a woman in a position of authority, how he was using his male privilege to dominate the conversation. Addison was nodding along, sipping her latte, adding a totally or I saw that every few seconds. I was just listening, replaying the moment in my head. The guy hadn't been aggressive. He'd raised his hand, waited to be called on. He'd asked about the source of the statistic and wondered if there was a different study with conflicting results. It was a normal academic question. The professor didn't even seem bothered by it. So I finally spoke up. Told them I didn't see it that way. Maybe he was just genuinely curious. Maybe he was trying to engage with the material, like a student is supposed to. Cameron stopped mid-rant and just stared at me. The look on her face was pure disbelief, like I'd just said the sky was green. She launched into a new speech, this one directed at me, about internalized misogyny, about how I was making excuses for toxic male behavior. Then she pointed at the barista behind the counter, a tired-looking guy in his mid-20s. She told me to look at his face. He wasn't smiling. He was just methodically making drinks. This, in her mind, was proof. He was radiating passive aggression because he had to serve 3 strong, independent women. That's when something in my brain just clicked. I looked at the barista. He didn't look aggressive. He looked exhausted. He looked like a guy working a minimum wage job while probably juggling classes, just trying to get through his shift. I told her my hypothesis. It wasn't a defense of men. It was a psychological observation. What if we're stuck in a feedback loop? We expect men to be hostile, so we treat them with coldness and suspicion from the get-go. They sense that hostility and react to it, either by being defensive or just shutting down and avoiding us. Then we take their reaction as confirmation of our original belief that they're all toxic, a self-fulfilling prophecy. I explained that our constant adversarial stance might be creating the very behavior we're condemning. Cameron actually laughed, a loud, sharp laugh. She said it was the most ridiculous, patriarchal apologist crap she'd ever heard. Addison looked back and forth between us, like she was watching a tennis match, not knowing whose side to take. The argument got pretty heated. Cameron insisted that men are inherently predisposed to dominate and manipulate, and any kindness shown to them would be interpreted as weakness and an invitation to be more aggressive. I maintained that most people, regardless of gender, respond in kind to how they're treated, Basic reciprocity. It ended with a challenge, a bet. Cameron proposed a 1-month social experiment. For 30 days, the three of us would have to deliberately treat men with basic, neutral to positive courtesy. The rules were simple, but went against every instinct we'd cultivated. Rule 1. No more default scowling or suspicious glares, neutral expressions, or even a small smile. Rule 2. Use basic pleasantries. Please, thank you, excuse me. Rule 3. Assume innocence until proven guilty. No automatically interpreting a simple question as a challenge to our intelligence or a gesture of help as a condescending power play. Cameron was practically glowing with confidence. She was certain this experiment would blow up in my face. She predicted that within a week, we'd be fending off unwanted advances, dealing with guys who felt entitled to our time and attention, and seeing their true nature emerge. She was sure it would prove her point beyond all doubt. I agreed. Addison, caught in the middle, reluctantly agreed too. We shook on it. The stakes weren't high, just $20 in bragging rights. But for me and Cameron, it was about proving our entire worldview. The next day, the experiment began. Our first test was, fittingly, the coffee shop. We walked in, and the same tired-looking barista was behind the counter. I could feel Cameron's smug energy radiating off her. She was ready for him to grunt at us. I ordered first. When he handed me my coffee, I looked him in the eye, gave a small smile, and said, "Thank you. Have a good one." He blinked. For a second, he looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression softened a tiny bit, and he said, "Yeah, you too?" It wasn't much, but it wasn't the grunt of a hostile caveman. Cameron and Addison did the same, though their thank yous were clipped and forced. He gave them the same brief, polite response. As we walked away, Cameron was already dismissing it, claimed it was a fluke, that he was probably just in a weird mood. A couple of days later, we were in the library. Addison needed a book from the top shelf. She's pretty short, couldn't reach it. There was a guy standing a few feet away looking at the books in the same section. Addison's normal move would be to stand there awkwardly, pretend to look at other books, and wait for him to leave so she could drag a stool over. I gave her a look, a pointed the experiment look. She sighed, and with the most painful reluctance, she walked over to the guy. She quietly asked if he could possibly help her get the book down. The guy turned, looked at the book, and without a word, he reached up, pulled it down, and handed it to her. He gave a little nod, then turned right back to his own search. That was it. No sleazy smile. No, "What's a pretty girl like you reading?" line. No asking for her number. He just performed a simple act of assistance, and then immediately disengaged. Addison walked back to our table and put the book down, looking completely bewildered. She said she was so sure he was going to try something. She had her rejection line all prepared. Cameron, who was watching from afar, argued that he was probably just intimidated because we were all there. "A group of women is a deterrent," she said. The excuses were already starting. The biggest test of that first week involved Lucian. Lucian was this guy in one of our psychology seminars. He was the definition of a ghost. Sat in the back corner, never spoke a word unless the professor directly called on him. He always looked like he was paying attention, scribbling notes, but he never participated in the discussions. In our little group, we had a name for guys like him. Wallpaper. There, but not really. To Cameron, his silence was suspicious, a form of quiet protest against the female-led discussion. During a debate about cognitive biases, the professor posed a really tough question. The whole class was stumped. Silence. I happened to glance over at Lucian's corner. I saw him quietly mumbling to himself, looking down at his notebook where he'd drawn some kind of complex diagram. Normally, I would have ignored it. None of my business. But the experiment was on my mind. Rule number 3. Assume innocence. So I raised my hand. The professor called on me. I told her I didn't have the answer, but I thought Lucian might have an interesting take on it. The entire class, all 30 people, turned to look at this guy who hadn't voluntarily spoken all semester. Lucian's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, like a deer in headlights. He looked completely panicked. For a second, I thought I'd made a huge mistake, that I'd just embarrassed him for no reason. The professor, looking intrigued, gently prompted him. "Lucian, any thoughts?" He hesitated. He looked from the professor to me, then down at his notes. Then he started talking, and he didn't just have a thought. He had a fully formed, incredibly insightful answer. He broke down the problem using a concept we hadn't even covered yet, explaining it clearly and concisely. He wasn't arrogant about it. His voice was quiet, a little shaky at first, but confident in the material. When he finished, the room was silent for a beat. Then the professor broke into a huge smile. She was blown away, praised him for bringing up such an advanced perspective. The rest of the class, people were looking at him differently, with respect. I felt this weird sense of pride, even though I hadn't done anything. After the class ended, as we were all packing up, Lucian made a beeline for the door. But on his way out, he passed my desk, paused for a fraction of a second, and said, "Hey, thanks." Then he was gone. Walking back to our dorm, Cameron was unusually quiet. Addison was the one who spoke, saying she had no idea Lucian was that smart. Cameron finally said that it was probably just a fluke, that he'd been waiting for a chance to show off, and I'd just given it to him. But her voice lacked its usual conviction. The first real crack was showing. Week 2 of the experiment began, and things started to feel different. It was subtle. The atmosphere in our seminar class felt less tense. A couple of the other guys who were usually quiet started chiming in more. It was like Lucian breaking the ice had given them permission to participate without fear of being shot down. The discussions became more balanced, more interesting. I realized I was actually looking forward to class, instead of just bracing for the next ideological battle. The next big incident involved Cameron directly, and it happened at the campus gym. The gym was, for Cameron, the absolute heart of darkness, the peak of toxic masculinity. She usually went with headphones on, a deep scowl on her face, projecting a force field that screamed, "Do not approach me." But this time, under the rules of the experiment, she had to at least look neutral. She was using one of the weight machines, struggling a bit with the last rep. A guy who was working out nearby came over. I saw it happen from across the room, where I was on a treadmill. My heart sank. This was it. This was the moment Cameron was waiting for. The unsolicited advice, the condescending, "Let me help you with that, little lady." The guy said something to her. She stopped, her whole body tensing up. He pointed to a pin on the machine's weight stack. She looked where he was pointing. She said something back. He nodded, said one more thing, and then walked away to get some water. He didn't linger. He didn't watch her. He just left. When we met up in the locker room afterwards, Cameron was silent. I had to ask, "What did he say?" She told me, her voice flat. He'd apparently pointed out that she'd put the safety pin in the wrong slot for the exercise she was doing. Told her it was a common mistake, but it could really mess up your shoulder if you weren't careful. That was it. He'd given her a piece of legitimate, helpful safety advice and then left her alone. She admitted that her first, overwhelming instinct was to snap at him for interrupting her workout, to tell him she didn't need a man's help. But the bet had stopped her. She'd forced herself to just say, "Oh, thanks," and fix the pin. She seemed genuinely shaken. The world wasn't behaving the way it was supposed to. The men weren't following the script she'd written for them. For me, the turning point of that week, maybe of the whole experiment, was another conversation with Lucian. It wasn't planned. I was studying late in an almost empty section of the library. He happened to be there too, a few tables away. I was stuck on a concept for our upcoming midterm, and on a whim, I walked over and asked if he had a minute. He seemed surprised to be approached, but he nodded. I asked my question. He didn't just give me the answer. He walked me through the logic, drawing little diagrams on a piece of scratch paper until I got it. We ended up talking for almost an hour, not just about class, but about movies, books, our majors. He was actually really funny, with a dry, sarcastic sense of humor. He wasn't the weird, silent wallpaper guy. He was just a normal, interesting person. Finally, I got the courage to ask him the question that had been bugging me for weeks. I asked him why he's always so quiet in class, when he clearly knows the material better than almost anyone. He looked down at the table for a second, just fiddling with his pen. Then he looked back at me and said something that I will probably never forget. He explained that it's just exhausting. He said he's seen what happens when a guy voices a strong opinion in that class, especially if it's a counter-argument. You immediately get labeled. You're aggressive. You're invalidating someone's lived experience. You're mansplaining. He said you have to weigh every single word, run it through a dozen filters before you speak, just to make sure it can't possibly be misinterpreted. And even then, it probably will be. So after a while, you just decide it's not worth the energy. He said it's just easier to keep your head down, do the work, and stay quiet. It's less about being shy and more about strategic self-preservation, a cost-benefit analysis where the cost of speaking is way too high. He called it walking on eggshells. I just sat there, completely floored, because for years I'd been on the other side of that. I was one of the people laying down the eggshells. I was part of the group that saw disagreement not as academic discourse, but as a personal attack. In my mind, the women in the room were the vulnerable ones, the ones who had to be protected. It had never, ever occurred to me that a guy like Lucian might feel vulnerable too, that he might feel like he was in a hostile environment where his words would be used against him. It completely flipped the script in my head. We'd spent so much time talking about how men create threatening spaces for women. I was suddenly confronted with the reality that we had created a threatening space for them, an environment where the price of participation was silence. I walked back to my dorm that night, feeling like my entire brain had been rewired. The experiment wasn't just about being polite anymore. It was about seeing the entire other side of the social dynamic that I had been completely blind to. I realized my hypothesis about a feedback loop was more right than I could have imagined. We weren't just getting hostility back. We were getting silence. We were getting disengagement. We were getting men who decided that the only winning move was not to play. The beginning of week 3 was when the divide in our little group became a chasm. Addison was a full convert. It was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She'd stopped analyzing every interaction for hidden meaning. She was just existing. I saw her one afternoon chatting with a guy from our stats class. They were laughing about how brutal the last problem set was. A few months ago, she would have come back to me and Cameron, and we would have spent an hour dissecting the conversation. Did you see the way he leaned in? He was trying to assert dominance? The joke he made was a microaggression. But this time, when she came over to my table in the library, she just smiled and said he was a pretty funny guy and had offered to share his study notes. It was so incredibly normal, it was almost shocking. Cameron, on the other hand, was getting more and more agitated. She was losing the bet, and she knew it. Her entire worldview was being challenged not by arguments, but by a month of relentless, mundane, positive interactions. She started trying to find evidence to support her original theory, like a conspiracy theorist looking for connections on a corkboard. She'd point out a guy on his phone while his girlfriend was talking and call it male detachment and emotional abuse. She'd claim a professor grading a male student's paper more leniently was proof of systemic bias, even though none of us had seen the grades. But Addison and I weren't buying it anymore. We'd just give non-committal shrugs. This made Cameron even more isolated and angry. In her eyes, we were betraying the cause. We were being brainwashed. The tension was building, and I knew something had to give. It all came to a head with our big end-of-semester group project. It was a huge portion of our final grade, and we'd been put into a group of 5. It was me, Addison, Lucian, and 2 other guys from the seminar. Cameron was in a different group, which, at the time, I saw as a blessing. Our first project meeting was awkward. The 2 other guys were hesitant, clearly used to being the wallpaper, just like Lucian. They were defaulting to letting me and Addison take the lead, probably assuming it was the safest option. But I remembered my conversation with Lucian. I made a conscious effort to change the dynamic. I treated it like a collaboration, not a battleground. I actively asked for their opinions. What do you think is the best way to approach this section? Does anyone have a stronger idea? It was slow at first, but it worked. Addison followed my lead. Lucian, seeing that the coast was clear, started to open up again. And once Lucian started contributing his well-thought-out ideas, the other 2 guys relaxed and joined in. By our third meeting, we were a well-oiled machine. We were actually having fun. We'd booked a study room in the library for the night before the presentation was due to put the finishing touches on everything. The mood was great. We had pizza, we were joking around, and the project was looking fantastic. Lucian was at the whiteboard, sketching out the flow of our presentation slides. He wasn't dictating. He was organizing everyone's contributions into a coherent structure. He'd point to a section and ask, "Okay, who's got the data for this part? We should lead with our strongest statistic here." He was a natural facilitator. Not a commander, a facilitator. There's a huge difference. We were all laughing at a joke one of the other guys made when the door to the study room opened. It was Cameron. She stood in the doorway for a second, taking in the scene. 5 people working together, a guy at the whiteboard. Her face hardened. I saw the look in her eyes. She thought she'd finally found it, her proof. She walked in, a smug, bitter smile on her face. She looked past me, past Addison, her eyes landing on Lucian. Then she said it, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Well, look at this. Man at the whiteboard, taking charge of all the little women. How predictably classic. I guess you're about to explain our own topic back to us now, are you?" The air went out of the room. Every bit of warmth, every bit of camaraderie just vanished. The 2 other guys froze, their eyes darting between Cameron and Lucian. Addison looked like she'd been slapped. Lucian, his reaction was the worst thing I've ever seen. He didn't get angry. He didn't get defensive. He just deflated. It was a physical thing. His shoulders slumped. The energy just drained out of him. The marker in his hand stopped moving. He stared at the board for a long moment, not seeing what he'd written. Then, very slowly, very deliberately, he put the cap back on the marker. It made a loud click in the dead, silent room. He picked up the eraser. Without saying a word, he wiped the entire whiteboard clean. All of our brainstorming, our structure, our flow, gone. He turned away from the board, avoiding everyone's eyes, and walked back to his seat. He sat down, opened his textbook, and just stared at it. The silence was deafening. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, one of the other guys cleared his throat and quietly asked, "So, what's the plan for the intro slide?" Lucian didn't look up from his book. He just said, his voice completely flat and monotone, "Forget it. It wasn't a good idea anyway. You guys figure it out." My blood began to boil. I turned to Cameron. She was still standing there, arms crossed, with a triumphant look on her face. She thought she'd won. I just snapped. All the frustration of the past month, all the revelations, all of it just came pouring out. I stood up and faced her, my voice low and shaking with anger. I asked her if she was happy. I pointed to Lucian, who was still pretending to read a book he wasn't seeing. I pointed to the other guys, who now looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. I told her to look at what she'd done. This wasn't a victory for feminism. This was just cruelty. She had walked into a room where people were collaborating as equals, and she had torn it apart with her bitterness. I told her that he wasn't taking charge. He was helping, he was contributing, and she had punished him for it. My voice got louder. I told her the experiment was over and she'd lost. Her theory was that if you treat men with decency, they become monsters. But the reality was that when you treat people like monsters, they just go away. They shut down. They stop trying. They disappear back into the wallpaper. You couldn't stand being wrong, I said, my voice cracking a little. You couldn't stand seeing it work, seeing people just get along, so you had to break it. You had to poison it just to prove to yourself that your miserable view of the world is the right one. Are you proud of yourself? Cameron's smug expression had completely melted away. She looked stunned, then hurt, then furious. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She just stared at me, then at Addison, who refused to meet her gaze. Then she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The project group was a wreck. The creative energy was dead. We managed to pull the presentation together, but it was mechanical. We just divided up the remaining work and agreed to meet right before class. Lucian sent his slides via email. He didn't say a word at the final meeting. We got a decent grade on the project, but the experience was ruined. The next day, I saw Lucian sitting alone outside the student union. I knew I had to talk to him. I owed him that. I walked over and sat down. I apologized for what my friend had said. He just shrugged, not looking at me. Don't worry about it. I'm used to it. That almost made it worse. I pressed a little, telling him he shouldn't have to be used to it. He finally looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes, just a profound, bone-deep weariness. He told me what it feels like from his perspective. He said life for a guy in our kind of academic environment isn't about walking on eggshells. It's about walking through a minefield. Every step is a risk. You can't win, he said. If you're confident, you're arrogant. If you're quiet, you're complicit or plotting something. If you try to help, you're condescending. If you don't help, you're apathetic and unsupportive. He told me about study groups where his ideas were ignored, only to be praised when a girl in the group repeated them 5 minutes later. He talked about being afraid to compliment a female classmate's work for fear of it being taken as a clumsy pickup attempt. He said the constant mental calculus is exhausting, analyzing every word, every tone, every gesture. So you just learn to check out, he concluded, looking off into the distance. You do your work, you keep your head down, you get your degree, and you get out. It's just easier. The fight isn't worth it. That conversation was the final nail in the coffin of my old belief system. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't an oppressor. He was just a guy trying to navigate a social landscape that had become, in its own way, just as hostile and unforgiving for him as I had always believed it was for me. The month-long bet officially ended a week later. The three of us met at the same coffee shop where it all started. We sat in silence for a long time. None of us knew what to say. Finally, Cameron reached into her wallet, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and slid it across the table to me. "You win," she said, her voice quiet. She still didn't fully concede. She said that while maybe her methods were too aggressive, she still believed the world was fundamentally stacked against women. But she admitted that she might have been wrong about the feedback loop, that maybe her own hostility had been coloring her interactions more than she realized. It wasn't a total conversion, but it was a start, a crack in the armor. I took the $20. It didn't feel like a victory. I looked at her and then at Addison, and I told them what I'd learned. It's not about being naive or letting your guard down. It's about choosing your battles. And maybe, just maybe, the default interaction with another human being shouldn't be a battle in the first place. I said the line that had been forming in my head for weeks. We spent so much time acting like we were at war. We can't be surprised when people start treating us like the enemy. We sat there for another minute in silence. And then the little bell on the coffee shop door rang. I glanced up, and it was Lucian. He was there with a friend. He saw me. Our eyes met across the room. In the past, he would have immediately looked away, maybe even turned around and left. But this time, he didn't. He said something to his friend, and then he started walking towards our table. My heart did a little nervous flutter. Cameron tensed up beside me. He stopped next to me, a small, hesitant smile on his face. "Hey," he said, "I was just wondering. The final for that class is going to be brutal. Do you maybe want to study for it together sometime?" I looked at him. A normal guy, asking a normal question. There was no hidden agenda, no power play. It was just an invitation. And for the first time in a long time, I could see it for what it was. I smiled back, a real, genuine smile. "Yeah," I said, "I'd like that a lot."